So I don't think we as Christians have any place in criticizing or judging other religions or their religious writings for hate or violence, considering we have done a massive amounts and probably the majority of the violence throughout history, and we have appropriated God's name in that violence and done some pretty horrific things. We can find lots of that in our own scriptures. And you see the hate that people spew today and justify it based on the things that they read in the Bible. So I think we have to remove the plank from our own eye before we even remotely start to criticize anybody else. And the truth is, we have to deal with the violence that we find in Scripture. A lot of times I hear from people on this app or in my comments about what about God killing so-and-so and committing genocide and people doing this violence in God's name. And that is a true struggle that we have to deal with. Because it is written in there. One of the things that we have to think about is, have people appropriated God's name, said God commanded us to do this, God told me to come do this, we're doing this in the name of God, and committed those acts and did it with the name of God, when it really wasn't God telling them to do that. It really wasn't God saying, go commit this. I know what's written. I understand what we have written, but I think it's a question that we have to ask. And if we come to the conclusion God did that, well, we have a struggle with that. But I think, for me as a preacher, I have to choose which God am I preaching on? Am I preaching on this violent God, this God that's going to send you to eternal fire, this judgmental God, this God that's going to lay the hammer down? Or am I going to preach on a God that I see reflected in Jesus? And that's something I believe. I believe that Jesus is the reflection of God in the world. I believe the church should be the reflection of Jesus in the world. Now, the church does a really shitty job at that at times. So we aren't very good at that. We need to be better in reflecting that ministry and love of Christ. But if Jesus is a reflection of God in the world, then to me, God isn't this violent, judgmental, demeaning, awful God that sometimes we equate with what we read in Scripture. So for me, God is this merciful God, this loving God, this grace-filled God. That is the God that I know. That is the God that I resonate the most with. That is the God that I preach. It's the God of liberation. It's the God who wants to be close to the marginalized. However, I know others don't read it that way, and I don't try to correct them. I think it's a struggle. It's a real struggle we have in dealing with the violence that we see in some of the scriptures regarding God, and it's a tussle we'll have, and something that we just join in community in and try to understand more and unravel. And I totally understand why people view God as such and why they have turned away from God. It's easy to turn away from God when Christians come appropriating God's name to do some horrendous violence in doing it, proclaiming Christ, proclaiming God. It's easy to turn away from that religion, and I don't blame them for that. I'm hoping that this loving gospel, and this God that I know, that I have seen at work in the world, is one that will resonate more with people, and they will come to know that God that is reflected in the nature of Jesus.